The shuttle's docking clamps engaged with a sound like the universe clearing its throat, and Dr. Elias Verne realized he was about to throw up in front of an empire. Not the best first impression, but then again, nothing about the last 3 weeks had gone according to plan. It had started with a hangover and a margin doodle that somehow cracked a 300-year-old alien puzzle, and now here he was, floating in a diplomatic shuttle that smelled faintly of recycled air and his own nervous sweat, about to meet a queen who ruled 1,000 worlds. The airlock iris spiraled open with unsettling organic smoothness, and Elias got his first look at the celestial throne. His brain struggled to process the scale. Calling it a starship was like calling Earth a pebble, technically accurate but missing the profound absurdity of the thing. The docking bay alone could have swallowed Manhattan. The walls weren't walls so much as they were living crystal that pulsed with bioluminescent veins, casting everything in shades of amber and violet that had no business existing in the same spectrum. Gravity felt wrong too, not absent or artificial, but somehow curated, as if the ship itself was deciding moment by moment exactly how heavy things should be. Ambassador Verne, said his escort, a human diplomat named Patricia Okonkwo, who had the exhausted look of someone who'd been managing interstellar incidents for too long. Try to remember, don't stare at their ears, don't comment on the gravity shifts, and for God's sake, don't mention the riddle unless they bring it up first. Right, Elias said, tugging at his ceremonial collar. Earth's diplomatic corps had stuffed him into something between a military uniform and a tuxedo, and he felt like a child playing dress-up. Just to clarify, when you say, don't mention the riddle, you mean the entire reason I'm here? The thing that apparently saved billions of lives? Especially that. The Aetheri have complicated feelings about being rescued by accident. It wasn't even an accident. It was procrastination. Patricia shot him a look that could have flash-frozen hydrogen. Then definitely don't mention that. They walked through corridors that seemed to anticipate their movement, walls shifting to accommodate their path in ways that made Elias's inner ear scream. Other beings passed them, Aetheri courtiers in flowing garments that defied physics, their long ears elegant and expressive in ways human ears could never manage, each sweep and angle apparently conveying meaning Elias couldn't begin to interpret. Some nodded to Patricia with careful diplomatic neutrality. Most ignored Elias entirely, which was fine by him. He'd spent his career studying dead languages in quiet university basements. Being ignored was practically his love language. The gravity shifted again, and Elias stumbled. An Aetheri woman carrying a stack of what looked like crystalline tablets adjusted her path to avoid him with fluid grace, her ears tilting back in what might have been annoyance or might have been concern. He had no idea. She wore simpler clothes than the courtiers, something utilitarian, and her ears were, he wasn't sure, but they seemed different somehow. Less ornate. Before he could process it, she was gone around a corner, and Patricia was pulling him forward. Focus, Elias. The throne room is ahead. The doors, if they could be called doors, were 3 stories tall and appeared to be made of solidified starlight. They opened silently, and sound hit Elias like a wall, not noise exactly, but presence. Hundreds of beings filled a space that shouldn't have been able to exist inside any ship, physics be damned. The ceiling vanished into impossible distance, and floating platforms drifted through the air bearing observers who watched with the casual intensity of gods examining a particularly interesting insect. And there, at the center of it all, Queen Lysara. Elias had seen the briefing holos, but they were lies. They'd failed to capture the sheer alien beauty of her, the way her features were almost human but just different enough to trigger some ancient instinct that whispered other in the back of his primate brain. Her ears swept back from her temples like wings, and her eyes held depths that suggested she'd been alive when Earth was still figuring out fire. She wore light itself, garments that shifted between states of matter as if they couldn't decide what they wanted to be. Patricia bowed. Elias, remembering his hasty coaching, attempted the same and nearly toppled forward. A ripple of something passed through the assembled court, amusement, maybe, or second-hand embarrassment. His neural implant, the one Earth had installed for translation, suddenly activated with a sensation like someone pouring cold water directly into his brain, and the ambient sounds resolved into voices, hundreds of them, speaking dozens of languages simultaneously. Hardly impressive. Earth's champion looks like. Wonder if he knows how ridiculous. Patricia cleared her throat meaningfully, and Elias remembered he was supposed to be doing something other than having an existential crisis. The Queen raised one elegant hand, and absolute silence fell like a curtain. Dr. Elias Verne of Earth, she said, and her voice was music and mathematics and the sound of stars being born. You have done our empire a service, though you did not mean to. You solved what our wisest could not, and in doing so, you saved the lives of billions across our domains. This is a debt we do not take lightly. Elias opened his mouth. His implant helpfully translated his nervous mumble into formal ethery, broadcasting it to the entire court. I really just thought the symbols looked neat and kind of resembled a Klein bottle topology, which seemed weird, so I. Patricia's elbow connected with his ribs with diplomatic precision. The Queen's expression didn't change, but her ears tilted forward slightly, and Elias had the uncomfortable sensation of being examined by something vastly more intelligent than himself. Regardless of your methods, Dr. Verne, you have earned the gratitude of the Ethery Empire. Therefore, I offer you this, name your reward, and if it is within my power to grant, it shall be yours. Wealth, rank, knowledge, alliance, speak, and let the court bear witness to your choice. The throne room seemed to hold its breath. Floating platforms drifted closer. Courtiers leaned forward with sudden predatory interest, their long ears sweeping into configurations Elias couldn't interpret. Somewhere in the assembled crowd, someone was already calculating odds, planning how to exploit whatever this idiot human asked for. Elias felt his stomach drop in that peculiar way that had nothing to do with gravity shifts and everything to do with recognizing that he'd just been handed a live grenade with a diplomatic pin. I need, he said slowly, his mouth suddenly dry, 3 days to think about it. The Queen smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Elias had ever seen. Granted. Day one of thinking about what to ask for from an interstellar empire, and Elias was already being stalked by a military commander whose decorations probably had their own gravitational field. Commander Thelvar had the kind of presence that made air molecules get out of his way preemptively, and his ears, swept back in what Elias's hastily downloaded cultural guide suggested was aggressive confidence, practically vibrated with martial enthusiasm. A fleet, Thelvar said, materializing beside Elias in what was supposedly a meditation garden but looked more like a geometry textbook having a nervous breakdown. Specifically, command of our 7th Expeditionary Force. 12 capital ships, support vessels, and a mandate to explore the outer veil. Your species would gain military experience, we would gain your unique perspective on spatial anomalies, and everyone benefits from the cultural exchange. Elias, who had been trying to figure out if the floating flower in front of him was a plant or a very patient jellyfish, blinked. I get seasick on boats. Space boats seem worse. There is no sickness in properly calibrated artificial gravity. I threw up during the shuttle docking yesterday. That was anticipatory nausea from meeting the Queen, not a failure of gravitic compensation. Thelvar's ears twitched with what might have been sympathy. Consider it, Dr. Verne. Your people are new to the galactic stage. A military foothold, even a small one, would accelerate your integration considerably. What Thelvar meant, Elias translated mentally, was that having a human commander in the ethery military structure would give Earth leverage and information it desperately needed, and probably give Thelvar himself a powerful patron in Earth's command structure. The politics made his head hurt. The floating flower jellyfish thing bumped against his hand, and he jerked back. I'll think about it, he lied, and Thelvar nodded with the satisfaction of someone who thought he'd planted a seed, when really he'd just watered Elias's growing sense of panic. Day 2 brought Merchant Prince Solen, who didn't stalk so much as manifest, suddenly present in the archive where Elias had fled to hide. She smelled like cinnamon and market spices and something electric that made his fillings ache. Her ears swept forward in calculated friendliness, and her smile suggested she could sell you your own kidneys and make you grateful for the discount. Trade monopoly, she said without preamble, settling onto a bench that grew out of the floor to accommodate her. Specifically, exclusive rights to broker ethery biotech to Earth markets for the next century. You'd be wealthy beyond your species' current economic models. Earth would leapfrog 3 technological stages. And I would have a reliable partner who understands human psychology in ways my analysts never could. Elias had been examining a data slate that displayed text in spiraling 3-dimensional patterns that gave him a headache. I'm a linguist. I don't know anything about trade. You understand human desire, which is the only economics that matters. Solène gestured, and a holographic display bloomed in the air between them, showing projected profit curves that climbed toward infinity with what Elias suspected was artistic license. Your people need what we have. Our biotech could cure diseases, extend lifespans, revolutionize your agriculture. And all I'm asking is that you be the bridge. For a modest percentage, I'm sure. For a partnership that benefits everyone involved. Her ears tilted at an angle his cultural guide labeled as sincere proposition. You're thinking too small, Dr. Verne. Why ask for gold when you could ask for the mine? She left him with promotional materials that were definitely alive and kept trying to show him testimonials from satisfied customers. He fed them to what he hoped was a recycling chute and tried not to think about how much sense her offer actually made. Day 3 brought the Queen's niece, and Elias seriously considered finding an airlock and taking his chances with vacuum. Princess Erin was beautiful in the way that supernovae were beautiful, objectively stunning and probably fatal at close range. She found him in his assigned quarters, which was either a breach of protocol or a demonstration of exactly how much protocol didn't apply to royalty. Marriage, she said, and Elias choked on the water he'd been drinking. I'm sorry, what? An alliance marriage between us would unite our peoples in the most traditional way. Erin moved through his quarters like she owned them, which, technically, her family did. Her ears swept through a complex pattern that his implant translated as political calculation mixed with genuine curiosity. You're not wholly unattractive for a human, and I'm told I'm considered beautiful by your standards. The symbolism alone would be worth a generation of diplomatic efforts. I'm really not marriage material, Elias managed. I once forgot my own birthday for 3 years. We have staff to remember things. I'm terrible at small talk. Royal marriages don't require conversation, just procreation and public appearances. She said it so matter-of-factly that Elias wondered if she was joking, but her ears remained in serious political mode. Think of what it would mean, Dr. Verne. Your genetic line merged with the royal house. Earth's position secured for centuries. And you'd have access to resources most of your species couldn't imagine in their wildest computational models. After she left, finally, after what felt like hours of outlining the political advantages with the enthusiasm of someone explaining a particularly good stock portfolio, Elias sat on his bed and put his head in his hands. 3 days, 3 offers, and each one more calculated than the last. Everyone wanted something from him, wanted to use his accidental heroism as a lever to move their own ambitions. He was thinking about this, spiraling into a familiar anxiety pattern, when he noticed her again. The same ethery woman from the docking bay, passing his open door carrying another stack of crystalline data slates. She glanced in, met his eyes for a fraction of a second, and her ears flicked back in what looked like startled apology before she hurried on. Something about that moment, the way she'd reacted like she shouldn't have been seen, like meeting his gaze was itself a transgression, made him move before thinking. He stepped into the corridor. Excuse me. She stopped, and he could see her shoulders tense. When she turned, her expression was carefully neutral, but her ears had flattened against her head in what his implant suggested was either fear or extreme deference. Up close, he could see what he'd noticed before. Her ears were noticeably thinner than the courtier's, less expressive, and her frame seemed almost fragile compared to the robust health of everyone else he'd met. Yes, honored guest. Her voice was quiet, and his implant provided the translation with a note that she was using an extremely formal register usually reserved for addressing superiors. I've seen you around. You work in the archives? Yes, honored guest. I catalog and maintain the historical records. She shifted the weight of the slates, and he noticed her hands trembling slightly. That sounds interesting. I'm Elias, by the way. I mean, you probably know that, everyone seems to know that, but I'm Elias. He was babbling. What's your name? She stared at him like he'd asked her to explain quantum mechanics using only interpretive dance. Syria, honored guest. It's nice to meet you, Syria. He meant it, and something about his sincerity must have registered, because her ears lifted slightly from their defensive position. The archives sound fascinating, actually. I'm a linguist, well, xenolinguist, and historical documents are kind of my thing. The archives are not typically open to, she stopped herself, recalibrating. If the honored guest wishes to view the archives, I can arrange for a proper tour with one of the senior. Could you show me? Elias asked, and watched her ears flick through several expressions of confusion. I mean, you work there. You probably know more about what's actually interesting than some official tour guide would. Syria's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. That would be highly irregular, honored guest. Elias. Just Elias, please. He smiled. And irregular sounds perfect. I've had 3 days of very regular offers from very important people, and I could use some irregular. She studied him with those careful eyes, and Elias had the sense of being evaluated in ways he couldn't understand. Finally, she nodded once, a minute gesture. Tomorrow, at the start of 3rd cycle. I'll meet you at Junction 7 Prime. But only for a brief time, I have duties. That's perfect. Thank you, Syria. She bowed, deeper than seemed necessary, and hurried away with her crystalline burden. Elias watched her go and felt, for the first time since arriving on this impossible ship, like he'd had a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to sell him something. His neural implant pinged with another message from Patricia, probably checking on his decision status. He ignored it and went to bed thinking about thin ears and quiet voices and the strange relief of being treated like a person instead of a political opportunity. Junction 7 Prime turned out to be a corridor intersection that looked like all the other corridor intersections, except this one had a viewport showing a nebula that Elias was reasonably sure was breathing. Syria appeared exactly on time, still carrying data slates like they were part of her anatomy, and her ears did that flattening thing again when she saw him actually waiting. You came, she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. I said I would. Elias gestured at the nebula. Is that thing alive, or am I having a stroke? The Veiled Nursery. It's a stellar formation region with unusual quantum properties. Some theorists believe it has a form of collective consciousness, but that's considered fringe science. Her ears relaxed slightly as she talked about facts instead of protocol. Most people don't notice the breathing pattern. Most people are probably busy being important. I'm just confused and looking for distractions. Something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. The archives are this way, honored, she caught herself. Elias. The archives were buried deep in the ship's structure, accessed through corridors that grew progressively less ornate until they were just functional spaces where the walls didn't bother pretending to be anything other than what they were. Elias passed other ethery workers, all with those same thinner ears, all wearing the same utilitarian clothing, and all giving Syria nervous glances when they saw her walking with him. Am I getting you in trouble? He asked. Possibly. But you're a guest of the Queen, so technically I'm providing you with requested services. Her ears flicked in what might have been amusement. And if I'm cataloging properly, this counts as cultural exchange facilitation. I like how you think. The archive doors opened into a space that made Elias's academic heart sing. Crystalline storage matrices rose in spiraling towers, each one containing compressed data from thousands of worlds. Holographic displays floated like frozen fireflies, and the air hummed with the white noise of processing power. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the throne room's calculated majesty and everything to do with the simple fact that this was where knowledge lived. "This is incredible," Elias breathed. "It's functional." Syria moved between the towers with practiced ease, setting down her burden of slates. Most courtiers never visit. They access what they need remotely and never think about how it's organized or who maintains it. Their loss. Elias reached toward a floating display, and Syria's hand shot out to stop him. "That's the biological record of the Kethran extinction event. If you access it without proper neural buffering, you'll experience approximately 3,000 years of species memory simultaneously, and your brain will leak out your ears." Elias pulled his hand back. "Thanks for that. Perhaps start with something less intense." She guided him to a smaller display showing what looked like a star map. "This is the Empire's expansion record. Every world, every first contact, every treaty and war and merger." The map was astonishing, a web of light spreading across the galaxy like neural pathways in some vast cosmic brain. Elias leaned closer, and Syria began explaining the color coding system, the temporal markers, the way certain routes showed trade patterns while others showed military campaigns. She spoke faster as she warmed to the subject, her ears lifting and swiveling to punctuate her points, and Elias realized she knew every single one of these worlds not as data points but as stories. "How do you remember all this?" he asked. She went quiet, and her ears flattened again. "I have time. And no one expects much else from me." "What does that mean?" Syria touched the display, and the map zoomed to show a single world, green and beautiful. "This is where I was born." Ethery colonies perform genetic screening at conception. Psionic potential, neural plasticity, physical optimization. The strong ones are celebrated, trained, given every opportunity. Her finger moved, and the image shifted to show a different facility, clinical and cold. The weak ones are redirected. We're not terminated, the Empire isn't cruel, but we're encouraged into support roles. Maintainers. Archivists. Labor that doesn't require the gifts that make someone truly ethery. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's horrible. It's efficient." Her voice was flat. "Why waste resources training someone who'll never be exceptional when those resources could elevate someone who will? The diminished serve the Empire by knowing our place." "The diminished. That's what you're called." "What we call ourselves." She pulled her hand back from the display. "Our ears are thinner because the genetic markers for psionic ability are linked to auditory development. We can't hear the quantum harmonics that allow telepathic communication. We're deaf to the songs that connect the truly gifted. So we work in archives and maintenance and all the invisible places that keep the Empire functioning while the beautiful people make history. That's the most depressing thing I've ever heard, and I once had to translate an alien species tax code." That got a real smile from her, brief but genuine. "You asked why I remember everything. It's because no one else cares enough to remember for us. The gifted access information and move on. But someone has to actually preserve it, organize it, make sure it's there when they need it. That's us. We're the Empire's memory, and they barely remember we exist." Elias looked at the star map, at the 1,000 worlds spinning in their careful orbits, and thought about all the people like Syria holding the whole thing together from the shadows. "Show me more." She did. For hours, they wandered through the archives, and Syria opened up in ways she clearly wasn't used to. She showed him artistic records from extinct civilizations, musical compositions that required six-dimensional mathematics to properly appreciate, poetry written in languages that used quantum superposition as grammar. She knew not just what everything was but what it meant, the context and the connections that made information into understanding. "You're brilliant," Elias said at one point, and watched her ears do something complicated that his implant translated as embarrassment mixed with disbelief. "I'm a cataloger." "You're a historian who happens to catalog. There's a difference." He gestured at the towers of data surrounding them. All of this would just be noise without someone who understands how it fits together. You're not maintaining records, you're maintaining meaning. Syria stared at him, and her ears had gone completely still in a way that suggested she was trying very hard not to react. Why do you care? Because I spent my entire career being ignored by people who thought knowing dead languages was useless, and then I accidentally saved an empire by doodling in the margins while hungover. Elias laughed, and it came out more bitter than he intended. I know what it's like to be invisible. And I know what it's like when the invisible people turn out to be the only ones actually paying attention. They stood in the silence of the archives, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 worlds, and Syria's ears finally moved again, sweeping forward in an expression his implant couldn't quite translate but that felt like recognition. What are you going to ask for? She said quietly. From the Queen. Everyone's talking about it. The merchant prince thinks you'll ask for trade rights. The military command is betting on fleet access. The princess is apparently very confident about marriage. Everyone wants me to ask for something that helps them. Elias touched the star map, watched worlds spin under his fingers. What would you ask for, if you could? Syria didn't answer immediately. Her hand came up to trace patterns in the air, and he realized she was touching worlds she'd catalogued, remembering their stories. To be seen, she said finally. Not as useful or efficient or appropriately placed. Just, seen. As a person who matters, even without the gifts that everyone thinks define worth. The words hung in the air between them like a chemical reaction waiting to happen, and Elias felt something click into place in his mind with the weight of a door closing on one path and opening on another. He thought about Commander Thelvar's fleet and Merchant Prince Solen's monopoly and Princess Erin's dynasty. He thought about everyone who'd spent 3 days trying to convince him that power was something you took from people who had it to give. And he thought about Syria, who knew more about the empire than anyone he'd met, standing in the archives that would collapse without her, invisible to everyone who mattered. I need to go, he said suddenly. Syria's ears flattened. Did I say something wrong? No. You said exactly the right thing. He turned to her, and he was grinning like an idiot, he could feel it. Thank you, Syria. For the tour, for the honesty, just thank you. He left her standing bewildered among the data towers and practically ran back to his quarters, his mind already racing through the chaos his decision was about to cause. Patricia was going to kill him. Earth's diplomatic corps was going to have a collective aneurysm. The Aethery court was going to lose its collective mind. But for the first time since arriving on this impossible ship, Elias knew exactly what he was going to do, and it felt right in a way that fleets and trade monopolies and royal marriages never could. He was going to burn down some very carefully constructed hierarchies, and he was going to enjoy every second of it. The throne room was even more crowded than it had been 3 days ago, which Elias hadn't thought was physically possible until he remembered that physics was apparently optional on a ship the size of a moon. Patricia had tried to brief him one last time before the ceremony, but he'd politely declined and watched her eyes start twitching in a way that suggested she was mentally updating her resume. You're about to make a decision that affects 2 civilizations, she'd said, her voice tight. Please tell me you've at least considered the geopolitical ramifications. I've considered them extensively, Elias had replied, which was technically true. He'd considered them and then decided to light them on fire and see what happened. Now he stood before Queen Lasara again, surrounded by what felt like every ambitious being in the empire, and tried not to think about how much his hands were sweating. The queen sat on her throne of consolidated starlight, and her ears swept through a pattern his implant tagged as amused anticipation. She knew something entertaining was about to happen. She just didn't know what yet. Dr. Elias Verne, she said, and her voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. 3 days have passed. The court has assembled to witness your choice. Speak, and claim your reward. The crowd leaned forward as one organism. Elias could see Commander Thelvar near the front, his military decorations gleaming with confidence. Merchant Prince Solen lounged on a floating platform, already calculating profit margins. Princess Erin stood with a contingent of royal advisors, her expression serene and her ears positioned in diplomatic victory. They all thought they knew what was coming. They were all wrong. "Your Majesty," Elias began, and his voice cracked slightly before his implants smoothed it out into formal ethery. "I've been offered many things over the past 3 days. Fleets and trade monopolies and marriage alliances. All of them valuable, all of them political, all of them designed to benefit people who are already powerful." Thelvar's ears perked up. Solen leaned forward. Erin's diplomatic serenity gained a sharp edge. "But I've also spent time in your archives," Elias continued, "learning about your empire's history. And I've met someone who knows more about that history than anyone I've encountered in this court. Someone who maintains and preserves the knowledge that your civilization depends on. Someone who's brilliant and dedicated and completely invisible to everyone who matters." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. The Queen's ears tilted forward, and Elias could see the exact moment she realized he was about to do something unprecedented. "Her name is Syria," he said clearly. "She's one of the diminished, one of your people born without psionic gifts, relegated to maintenance work, treated as genetically inferior. And I choose her." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before the throne room erupted into chaos. "What?" Commander Thelvar's bellow cut through the noise. "This is an insult. An obscenity. He's mocking us," someone else shouted, and Elias's implant struggled to keep up with the overlapping translations as courtiers began shouting over each other. The psionic members of the court, which was most of them, generated feedback that made the air itself feel angry, a pressure that built behind Elias's eyes and made his teeth ache. The human chooses garbage over alliance. This must be a misunderstanding. Someone explained to the primitive that. Silence. The Queen's voice didn't rise in volume, but it cut through the chaos like physics reasserting itself after a temporary vacation. The throne room went instantly, profoundly quiet. Her ears had swept back in an expression Elias's implant tagged as dangerous interest, and when she looked at him, he felt like an equation being solved in real time. "Explain yourself, human." Her voice was soft now, which was somehow more terrifying than if she'd been shouting. "Make me understand why you chose the last when you could have had the first." Elias took a breath. This was it, the moment where he either made his point or got himself ejected from an airlock for terminal stupidity. "Because your empire has built itself on a lie, your Majesty." The court gasped. Patricia, somewhere in the crowd, probably had a small stroke. "You've convinced yourselves that worth is determined by genetic markers and psionic potential," Elias continued, his voice steadier now. "That the diminished are lesser because they can't hear quantum harmonics or communicate telepathically. But I've seen your archives. I've watched how they function. And I've realized something you've all apparently forgotten. Power that can't see its own foundations is built on sand. The diminished serve necessary functions," Princess Erin said coldly. "That doesn't make them equal. They hold your entire civilization together." Elias shot back. "Syria knows more about your empire's history than your entire council of advisors combined. She can tell you the story of every world you've conquered, every species you've absorbed, every mistake you've made and covered up. She maintains the archives that your gifted ones access without thinking, preserves the knowledge that makes your power possible. And you call her diminished? She lacks the fundamental abilities that define our species," someone argued. "No, she lacks the abilities you've decided define worth, which is different." Elias was on a roll now, propelled by 3 days of watching people treat him like a political chess piece and years of being dismissed by people who thought knowing dead languages was useless. "My own species nearly destroyed itself with hierarchies like this. We decided that certain genetic traits or skin colors or genders made people inferior, and we built entire civilizations on that lie. And every single time, we found out the hard way that the people we'd pushed to the bottom were the ones holding everything up." The Queen hadn't moved. Her ears remained in that position of dangerous interest, and Elias couldn't tell if she was about to applaud or have him executed. You want to know why I chose Syria, he said, looking directly at Queen Lysara. Because she represents your empire's greatest weakness. You've made yourselves blind to the worth of the people who actually make everything work. You've created an entire class of citizens who are invisible to you, and you're so convinced of your own genetic superiority that you can't see how dependent you are on them. That's not strength. That's fragility pretending to be power. And what exactly do you expect us to do about this perceived weakness? Solen's voice dripped with contempt. Pretend that genetic optimization doesn't matter. Celebrate mediocrity. I expect you to open your eyes. Elias gestured at the assembled court. Everyone in this room is gifted, powerful, psionically talented. And not one of you noticed that your entire archive system would collapse without people you consider inferior. Not one of you knows the name of the person who maintains the environmental systems that keep you alive, or catalogs the laws that govern your empire, or does any of the 1,000 invisible tasks that make your comfortable existence possible. He turned back to the queen, and something reckless made him smile. You asked me to name my reward, your majesty. I'm naming Syria, one of the diminished, to be granted full citizenship, full rights, and a position of honor in this court. Not as charity, not as a gesture, as recognition that she and people like her have worth that your empire has systematically refused to acknowledge. You want to pay your debt to me? Stop being blind to the people who hold your civilization together. The throne room was so quiet Elias could hear his own heartbeat. Every ear in the room was focused on the queen, waiting to see how she would respond to what was essentially a human calling her entire civilization morally bankrupt to her face. And then Queen Lysara laughed. It wasn't a polite court laugh or a diplomatic chuckle. It was a deep, genuine, almost savage sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal and amused and possibly slightly unhinged. She laughed until her ears swept through patterns Elias had never seen, until the court began to shift uncomfortably, until even Elias started to wonder if he'd broken something important. Oh, she said finally, her eyes bright with something that might have been respect or fury or both. Oh, you magnificent, foolish creature. You come to my court, accept my hospitality, and then stand here and tell me my empire is built on a foundation of deliberate blindness. Yes, your majesty. And you think I haven't noticed? That brought Elias up short. The queen's smile was sharp enough to cut atmospheres. Did you think, she continued, her voice soft and deadly, that an empire that has lasted 3,000 years was unaware of its own structural dependencies? That I, who have ruled for 600 of those years, have failed to see the people who maintain my archives, my ships, my systems? Her ears swept forward, and Elias felt like he was being examined by something vast and ancient. The question, Dr. Verne, is not whether I see them. The question is what I choose to do about it. She stood, and the throne room seemed to reorganize itself around her movement. You have named your reward, and I grant it. Syria of the Archives is hereby elevated to full citizenship, given voice in this court, and recognized as a person of worth by imperial decree. The court exploded again, but the queen wasn't finished. Furthermore, I declare a century of examination. For the next 100 years, the status of all diminished will be systematically reviewed, and the genetic orthodoxy that has governed our empire will be questioned, challenged, and potentially reformed. The century of examination announcement hit the celestial throne like a quantum detonation in a teacup. Within hours, every court faction was in emergency session, every political alliance was being frantically renegotiated, and Patricia had sent Elias 17 increasingly desperate messages that he'd ignored because he was too busy trying not to hyperventilate in his quarters. He'd meant to help one person. He'd accidentally destabilized a 3,000-year-old social structure. This is fine, he told himself, pacing in circles while the walls helpfully adjusted their bioluminescence to what they probably thought was a calming amber but actually looked like the color of impending disaster. This is completely fine. I just convinced an interstellar empire to question its fundamental assumptions about genetic worth. No pressure. Nothing that could possibly start a civil war. His door chimed, and he seriously considered pretending he'd been sucked out an airlock. But it chimed again with the persistence of someone who knew he was definitely inside, so he opened it to find Syria standing there looking like she'd been hit by a meteor made of disbelief. "You're insane," she said without preamble. "That's becoming a common assessment. Do you have any idea what you've done?" She pushed past him into his quarters, and her ears were cycling through expressions so rapidly his implant gave up trying to translate them. "The entire court is in chaos. Half the diminished don't know whether to celebrate or hide. Commander Thelvar tried to challenge you to ritual combat before someone reminded him humans don't have combat-relevant genetic modifications. And I'm apparently now a full citizen with voice in court, which means I can legally speak in the presence of the Queen without permission, which is terrifying. You're welcome. I didn't ask for this." She whirled on him, and her ears had flattened in what looked like anger but might have been panic or possibly both. "I told you I wanted to be seen, not turned into a political symbol for systemic reform. Do you know how many people are going to hate me now? How many diminished are going to think I betrayed them by accepting elevation? How many gifted courtiers are going to see me as an insult to everything they believe?" Elias felt his stomach drop. "I didn't think about that." Clearly. She was pacing now, mirroring his earlier circles. "You just charged in like some kind of human chaos agent and decided to fix everything without considering that maybe the people you're fixing things for might have opinions about it." "You're right." Elias sat down on his bed heavily. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in making a point and didn't think about what it would actually mean for you. That was selfish and stupid." Syria stopped pacing. Her ears did something complicated. "You're apologizing." "Of course I'm apologizing. I screwed up. But you got what you wanted." The Queen agreed. "I'm elevated, the examination is happening, you made your grand statement." She was staring at him like he was a particularly confusing equation. "Why would you apologize now?" "Because getting what I wanted doesn't mean I did it right." Elias rubbed his face. "I should have asked you first. Should have considered what you wanted instead of using you to make a political point, even if I thought it was a good point. That's exactly what everyone else was doing to me, treating me like a tool for their agenda instead of a person, and I just turned around and did the same thing to you." The silence stretched long enough that Elias started mentally composing a more comprehensive apology, but then Syria laughed. It was a slightly hysterical sound, but it was genuine. "You really are insane," she said, but her ears had softened into something that might have been affection. "A normal person would have taken the fleet or the trade monopoly or the royal marriage and gone home to be celebrated as Earth's hero. But you chose chaos and are now apologizing for succeeding. I contain multitudes of poor decision-making." She sat down next to him, and for a moment they just existed in the quiet of his quarters while the empire rearranged itself around them. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "I am terrified. But I'm also hopeful." Which is new. The diminished have been invisible for so long that we stopped imagining we could be anything else. And now there's going to be an examination, a century of questioning the systems we thought were permanent. Her hand found his, and her fingers were shaking slightly. "So thank you. And also I'm furious with you. And also thank you again. That seems fair." The weeks that followed were, to use Patricia's technical diplomatic term, an absolute shitshow of cascading consequences. Commander Thelvar had been reassigned to a border patrol posting after his combat challenge attempt, which everyone knew was a political demotion but which he was spinning as a voluntary pursuit of honor. Merchant Prince Solen had pivoted with impressive speed and was now offering trade packages specifically designed for integration of previously underutilized populations, which was capitalism's way of saying she'd figured out how to profit from reform. Princess Erin had stopped speaking to Elias entirely, which he considered a significant improvement over her marriage proposal. The diminished themselves were having complicated reactions. Some celebrated. Some were angry at being made visible without consent. Some were cautiously optimistic. Some wanted nothing to do with the whole mess and just wanted to keep their heads down and do their jobs. Syria spent most of her time in the archives, now as an official, cultural integration advisor, with a salary that made Elias's academic stipend look like spare change, trying to navigate between communities that had completely different ideas about what her elevation meant. Elias helped when he could, mostly by being someone she could yell at when the pressure got too intense. He discovered that being useful didn't always mean fixing things. Sometimes it just meant being present while someone else figured out how to fix themselves. Earth's response had been predictably Earth-like: excitement, confusion, political infighting about what it meant for their galactic standing, and 17 academic papers analyzing his decision from every possible angle. His university had sent a message offering him a promotion and then a second message asking if he'd meant to cause an interstellar incident. He'd responded to neither. 3 months after the ceremony, Elias stood in the archives with Syria, looking at a new star map she'd created. It showed the same empire as before, but with additional layers: population density of the diminished, resource flows, infrastructure dependencies. It was a map of the invisible empire beneath the visible one, and it was staggering. "This is what they couldn't see," Syria said quietly. "Every yellow line is a supply chain maintained by diminished workers. Every blue node is a system that would fail without us. The empire isn't just supported by us, it's threaded through with us. We're not the foundation, we're the entire circulatory system. Have you shown this to the Queen?" "Yesterday." She looked at it for 3 minutes without saying anything, and then she asked me to prepare a comprehensive analysis for the examination committee. Syria's ears swept through an expression that might have been pride or terror or both. "I think she already knew. I think she's always known. But there's a difference between knowing something privately and having it documented officially. She's scarier than I thought," Elias admitted. "She's been queen for 600 years. You don't last that long by being blind to structural problems, you last by being very strategic about when and how you address them." Syria pulled up another display, this one showing preliminary examination results. 40% of diminished surveyed want status quo. 35% want full integration. 20% want separate but equal recognition. 5% want to burn the whole system down and start over. Democracy is messy. This isn't democracy, it's barely organized chaos with imperial oversight. But she was smiling. "It's going to take the full century, maybe longer. There will be backlash and resistance and probably violence in some regions. Some diminished will be elevated and some will choose to remain as they are. The gifted will fight to preserve their advantages, and some will genuinely work toward change. It's going to be complicated and uncomfortable and nothing like what you probably imagined when you made your dramatic speech. Sounds about right for something I did while panicking." Syria turned to face him, and her ears swept forward in an expression his implant finally, after months of learning, could properly read: genuine affection mixed with exasperation. "You're going back to Earth soon. Next week. Patricia says if I stay any longer she can't guarantee my safety from people who think I'm either a revolutionary hero or a chaos agent who needs to be quietly disappeared. Both assessments are probably accurate." She hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket, a crystalline data slate, smaller than the ones she usually carried. "I made you something. A translation matrix for ethery historical documents, calibrated for human neural architecture. And also some of my favorite records from the archives. Stories I thought you'd appreciate." Elias took it carefully, feeling the weight of data and meaning compressed into crystal. "Thank you, Syria. Thank you for seeing me." She said it simply, and her ears had gone still in a way that suggested deep sincerity. "Even if you did it in the most chaotic and publicly disruptive way possible." They stood in the archives one last time, surrounded by the memory of 1,000 worlds, and Elias thought about how he'd arrived expecting to ask for something simple and safe and had instead chosen to light a match in a room full of carefully stacked political dynamite. It had been terrifying and stupid and possibly the most important thing he'd ever do. The Queen granted him a private audience before his departure. She received him in a smaller chamber, less theatrical than the throne room, where the walls showed real-time feeds of her empire's worlds spinning in their orbits. "You've caused me considerable trouble, Dr. Verne," she said without preamble. "I've noticed, Your Majesty. You will also be pleased to know that your chaos has already produced measurable results. 17 systems have begun voluntary integration programs. The archives have received formal recognition as essential imperial infrastructure. And I have been forced to have conversations with advisors about structural inequality that they have been skillfully avoiding for decades." Her ears swept through an expression that might have been amusement. "I should have you executed for the inconvenience, but I find I'm too entertained by the results. I appreciate the restraint, Your Majesty. Do you know why I really granted your request?" She turned from the displays to look at him directly. "It wasn't your speech, eloquent as it was. It wasn't even your point about foundations and blindness, though that was well made. Then why? Because you chose something that had no benefit to you personally." Her smile was sharp and knowing. "Every other supplicant who has stood before me has chosen rewards that elevated themselves. But you chose to elevate someone else, at considerable personal risk and political cost. That is either profound wisdom or profound foolishness, and I have lived long enough to know they are often the same thing." She gestured, and a small object materialized in the air between them, a crystal pendant that pulsed with soft light. "A gift. It contains a quantum link to the Celestial Throne's communication network. Should you ever need to reach me, or should I need to reach you for consultation on this mess you've helped create, it will function anywhere in the galaxy." Elias accepted it carefully. "You think you'll need to consult me?" "I think that humans have a particular talent for looking at systems from outside and asking uncomfortable questions. And I think the century of examination will be full of uncomfortable questions that require outside perspectives." Her ears tilted forward. "Also, Syria has requested that you be granted visiting scholar status in the archives, and I find myself inclined to indulge her." "She did. She is learning to leverage her new position effectively. It's satisfying to watch." The Queen's expression softened slightly. "You changed something here, Dr. Verne. Not quickly, not cleanly, but genuinely. That is rarer than you might think." The shuttle back to Earth was smaller and less ceremonial than his arrival, which suited Elias fine. Patricia sat across from him, reviewing reports on her tablet and occasionally sighing with the weight of someone who'd spent 3 months managing diplomatic fallout. "You're going to be famous, you know," she said without looking up. "The human who reformed an alien empire. Earth's councils are already fighting over how to spin it. I didn't reform anything. I just pointed out something that was already there. You destabilized a 3,000-year-old social structure because you made friends with an archivist. When you put it like that, it sounds almost reasonable." Patricia finally looked up, and her expression was complicated. It was brave. Stupid, but brave. And maybe that's what the situation needed, someone too naive to know all the reasons why it wouldn't work. She smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't ask for the fleet." The stars slid past the viewport, and Elias touched the crystal pendant the Queen had given him, feeling its subtle pulse against his palm. He thought about Syria navigating her new role, about the diminished across the empire learning they might be seen, about a queen who'd been waiting 600 years for someone to point out the obvious. He'd come expecting to receive a reward and had instead given one. And somehow, in the messy, complicated aftermath, that felt like exactly the right kind of chaos to have caused. Earth appeared in the viewport, blue and familiar and probably completely unprepared for what he was bringing home, not trade rights or military alliance, but a story about how sometimes the most important thing you can do is see the people everyone else has forgotten to look at. It wasn't gold or power or dynasty. But it was real, and it mattered, and as the shuttle began its descent, Elias found himself grinning like an idiot who'd accidentally changed the galaxy by being too stubborn to accept the obvious choices. Which, he supposed, was exactly what he'd done.